Hi, everyone. Just a few words here about everyone's favorite topic, thesis statements. So, again, a thesis statement is something that you will need for the sort of scholarly part of your paper. And so, even though I know you've all had English composition way back uh, in your undergraduate days, maybe every once in a while it's good to review these topics. So, thesis statements. What is a thesis statement? Um, this is my own definition, which you can take or leave, but a thesis statement is a clear, concise statement of the argument or point of view that you, the writer, are going to present in the rest of the paper. So, in essence, the thesis statement is what the paper is about, what you are investigating in your paper. And so, conventionally, your reader, that is me, expects to see the thesis statement at or near the end of the introduction to the paper. So traditionally, introductions are a paragraph or two long. I would say in this course, introductions don't need to be terribly lengthy unless you find the need to make a lengthy one. But after kind of this general introduction, near the end, your reader expects to see a thesis statement. So it's usually one of the last, maybe the last statement in the introduction or very near the end of the introduction to your paper. Usually the thesis statement is one sentence or a couple of sentences at the most, so something that's really concise. Now, what do I mean by argument? So here's kind of the sense of where that comes from. To make your paper a worthwhile project, you need to present your insight or perspective that's not apparent in the text. So if you're going to write about something that I could have found out just by reading the story, that to me is not, it's not interpretation. It's not exegesis. It's more like a book report. It's more like something just telling me how the story goes, or it's reproducing the story that's already in the Bible. And since we've been talking about Judges here together for a long period of time now, we all kind of know the stories. We're all familiar with the stories. You don't need to remind us how the stories go. Now, you might point to specific things in the story that happen that support your argument, but by and large, you don't have to retell the story. We already know the story. So here's a good example. Deborah is a strong leader. So that as a thesis statement is not a very good argument. So it is a point of view. It is an opinion. But why is it not a good argument? Why? Because this is fairly apparent in the text itself. So if you gave the story to, I don't know, 100 people, probably 98 or 99 would agree with your statement. So to say that Deborah is a strong leader is probably something that's already apparent in the text. Or sometimes I like to use the example, Abraham was a man of faith. Well, yes, Abraham was a man of faith. There's nothing wrong with that statement per se. It's just not a very good argument. It's not an interesting topic for a paper. It doesn't require a lot of interpretation. So if you're making a thesis statement and you can't imagine most people disagreeing with it, it's not a good thesis statement. So you have to sort of, I don't know, take people by surprise a little bit, perhaps, or say something that is slightly provocative, maybe, to come up with a good topic for your paper. At least take a strong point of view. Now, if you were to write a paper where your thesis statement was Deborah is a weak leader, that would indeed be an argument. So if somebody turned in a paper like that, I would think, my first thought would be, wow, really? Is that really true? I am skeptical. I am skeptical that this person will be able to show me enough evidence that I will be able to come to this same conclusion. Now, I don't, toss out ideas just because I don't agree with them. So I would read the paper with an open mind, but I would also simultaneously be a little bit skeptical about that. So, a little bit of skepticism is a healthy thing, and so you want, I don't know, you want your reader to say, okay, well, if you say so, but show me how this is the case. So good readers are always from Missouri. They want to see the evidence. They say, show me how this works. Here's another probably more reasonable thesis statement. Yael had to kill Sisera to preserve her own life. So that is an argument. The text does not say that. You may have assumed that every time you've read the story that this is what Yael had to do, but the text doesn't say. This is your interpretation of the events that are going on. So all of our work posting, all of those great and probably some every once in a while somewhat tedious posts all along these 10 weeks have encouraged you to ask questions, to explore, to investigate. So exegesis and forming arguments, I hope, isn't something that's still terribly scary to you. You've been practicing it over and over again, and that's why we do these posts, so that you will practice interpreting. And hopefully this has given you a little bit of a background, and you can see that when you post something, not everybody agrees with you, and that's perfectly fine. People have different points of view, but this is the way to form an argument. So you want to make sure you're focusing on an argument and not just a statement of this is what the story says. So your statement has to be a reasonable conclusion that one could make based on the text, but it's also something about which people could and do disagree. So if you can imagine somebody disagreeing with you, then you're probably actually on the right track. So there are some things that cannot be reasonably concluded from reading the text. So if your thesis statement was, I believe Sisera was, I don't know, an interterrestrial alien, okay, maybe so, but you're going to have a really hard time convincing me using the biblical text as your evidence. So they have to be reasonable conclusions. They can't sort of read contrary to the evidence that we're given, but it's not something that's apparent from the text either. So again, one could imagine people disagreeing with a particular assertion or a claim. Here's a little bit slightly different way of tackling thesis statements, but sometimes this light bulbs go off for people when I present it this way. So sometimes or often thesis statements take the form of, you might actually think that X, this particular thing, is the case, but actually Y is the case. And I, as the writer, am going to show you that you might think this, but actually I'm going to show you that it's really like this. So it's kind of a pushing back against popular assumptions about stories. So we all have ideas about these stories that were probably, if you again grew up in the church, that are probably formed from way back. And now that we're coming back and reading the text, you see, I don't exactly see this story in the same way as an adult anymore. Or I haven't thought about this story for 5 years, 10 years. Now I see it quite differently. So sometimes thesis statements that are set up like this seem to work well for people. So I'm just throwing that out there if you find that helpful. So something unexpected, I think, is inherently interesting. So we do want your papers to be interesting. And if they just sort of give what everybody already thinks is the case, it may be accurate, but not particularly interesting. And it also demonstrates that you've done a close reading of the text. So what is a close reading? Maybe this is again a term you might be familiar with from college literature class or from other classes on the Bible. But a close reading begins with the assumption that the biblical text, which is the subject text that we're talking about, has been carefully composed. So I, as a biblical scholar over the years, have come to believe that the words that are chosen by the writer were very carefully selected, and that these words, show sort of, I don't know, almost a genius in the way the storyteller is able to tell the story. So it isn't that the stories are just composed sort of as, I don't know, kind of a slapdash report like you might find again in the newspaper. I talked about how, to me, the Bible isn't the newspaper. It's not something we read and we just say, oh, okay, that's interesting news, and then toss it in the trash, never to think about it again. But that the Bible has been carefully composed, and that the stories are there, again, for a reason. They're not just there to report history, because I'm sure the Bible could be even much, much, much longer than it already is. In fact, if you read in the books of Kings, the Bible even refers to other books that have more stories. And it says, if you want to learn more about this king, read the Annals of the Kings, or whatever these books are called in the books of Kings. So they're already telling you that the Bible doesn't tell you everything that happened, and that's not the point of the Bible. But these are stories that are carefully written, carefully selected, and they're there for a reason. So, given that assumption, you should also read as carefully as the biblical writers have written in the same careful fashion. So you pay attention to words, phrasings, little events that might pass by in a cursory reading. So you are a careful reader. And you pay careful attention to the details of the text, the wording, structure, characterization, etc. So I hope this makes sense. And I think what comes out of a close reading most of the time is you will discover things about the text that you're working on that you never saw before. I think that is almost, I don't know, I shouldn't go out on a limb here, but it's almost a universal experience that even if you've read these stories before, a close reading and careful, thoughtful reading will almost always reveal something about the text to you. Maybe that's my own experience talking, but that's how it works for me. If you want an example of a close reading, the Phyllis Tribble reading of Judges 19, I think, is a good example of a close reading where she pays very, very close attention to details and to structure, and it's just a good example of what it means when people toss around this term close reading. So, what if you start off your paper with this nice, well-worded thesis statement, and you're doing your work, and you're doing your writing, and new ideas come to you, and you discover things that you hadn't noticed before. So what if my paper goes places that I didn't expect? So, you know what they say about best laid plans. So that's really very simple. You just revise your thesis. So at least when I write, I usually have a tentative thesis statement Sometimes it's not as clear as I would like. Sometimes it probably needs a little tweaking, but I write one down and I move on. And then when the paper's all done, I'll come back and I'll look at that thesis statement again and I'll ask myself, is this really what this paper is still about? Or does this thesis statement still act as kind of an umbrella that covers all of the various things that I've talked about in my paper? And if it doesn't, then it needs some revision or some tweaking after the process is all done. So a thesis is kind of your starting place in your paper, but it's also something you circle back to at the end of your paper just to double check and make sure that, yes, I did end up writing what I planned to write about, or I need to kind of change the agenda here a little bit to better reflect what it is that I ended up saying. So review your thesis when the paper is complete. Ask yourself, does the statement truly cover what it is that I intended to say, or what it is that I ended up saying when I was all done? And I think this just goes to show that writing itself is part of the discovery process. And again, just speaking from my own experience, for me, I don't have everything perfectly formulated in my head before I start writing. I have some general ideas. I know probably the direction that my paper is going to take, but I don't know everything about it. And it is in coming to explain my thoughts and my way of thinking and my argument that I myself, as a writer, come to learn more about what it is that I'm saying. So to me, writing proves this old maxim about, you never really learn something until you have to explain it to somebody else. And I think writing is very much that way, is that you really do learn a lot in the process if you take it seriously. And it's just can be very eye-opening. And I can remember having a lot of sort of epiphany experiences while writing. I started off a paper and then I discovered something and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And actually, this new thing is what the paper needs to be about. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful to you thinking about thesis statements. If you're an old hand at this, I hope this hasn't insulted your intelligence. But I think it's always something to revisit and remember that this is really one of the key linchpins in your writing project. So best of luck in your writing. If you have questions about thesis statements or anything else in the writing process, please do feel free to ask. Hope things are going well, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.